Hi, this is Monica Perez here today with Parallel Mike of Parallel Systems Broadcast, where Mike invites you to join him on the path from dependence to independence. He approaches this through a deeper understanding of the global financial system. He addresses food security, personal and kind of big picture, as well as the meaning of freedom, the true meaning of freedom. And that's something that I've been really struggling with lately as I go on my own journey. And so I'm really eager to cover these topics with Mike today. And I hope you'll enjoy this. And if you're ready, strap on your tanks because we are going deep with a dive master. Hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, Monica. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm a big fan, having been introduced to you from a fellow. Well, you had him as a guest, and I was actually a guest on his show. So that's how I found you. And here we are. So
yes, the political dark side. And I have to say, I loved your conversation with Matt. I just thought that was a great one. And I'm hoping to touch on some of those subjects today. I think I want to first back up a little bit and kind of tell people, or if you could tell us your background, educational background, or how you career stuff, just the before time of from when you got so awake to what's really going on that you decided to live it. What was going on with you before that?
yeah, well, I guess it depends how far back we go on that one, Monica, because you'll probably do a podcast in itself just on my background if I tell you too much. So, well, basically, I was born in a very working class city. My father was what you would in America call a high-ranking member of the mafia, but in Britain we call it gangsters. So yeah, exactly. It was a very interesting childhood. He got arrested trying to smuggle $40 million worth of drugs into the country. So that was my childhood. It was being around this kind of life of gangland and crime. So very interesting childhood, but we can skip that bit and move forward. So, yeah, basically I never had no background in finance. My background was actually having managed to a vet, going down a similar path to my father. I ended up getting involved in sports. I became good at boxing. I did that nationally. Then went to university. Yeah, did theology, and that was an interesting subject. And then went back and did social work and became basically a therapist and counselor to young people who were growing up in a traumatic situation. So yeah, that was my background. Then again, jumping forward quite far to where the finance came in, basically as I got further into my career, I was also still an athlete. So I was running, I was a long distance endurance athlete. That came to an end through injury. So after that, I was kind of like, well, what do I do next? I had all of my dreams wrapped up in this vision of a future. I was going to be running internationally. I had gone full time as an athlete. I was just working enough just to get by. Certainly wasn't a lucrative career being a long distance endurance athlete. It was poverty for sure, Monica. However, I loved it. I enjoyed it. Running in the mountains 100 miles a week was my thing. And yeah, that came to an end through injury, and it was an abrupt one. And that left me in quite a state. I was like, what do I do next? That was all my dreams and ambitions. So I bought a boat of all things, and I moved on to my boat and thought, I'm going to sail the world. So this was the next step for me. And then I met my wife around that time too. And I already had a good grasp of history. I had a good grasp of central banking. However, I had kind of ignored all of that stuff to get on with my life. And at this point, we both decided, listen, we've got very little savings. We felt something was on the horizon, but I didn't know what. So I started to study it. And as I went down that rabbit hole into international finance, the monetary system, the history of money, I basically just immersed myself in it because I realized this is what I need to know. This is what I need to learn. This is going to lead me to that place of understanding. And fast forward the next 4 years, that was it. I was spending 50, 60 hours a week studying. My wife was learning all old school skills so that we could get ourselves prepared. We basically felt like a big flood was coming and decided we needed to get a farm. We needed to grow our own food. And we needed money, so I had to understand finance and figure out how to get some. This is the one thing I'd always neglected. So fast forward 4 years, COVID came. We knew something big was coming. That was really the start of it. However, I also understood by that point that this was just the start of something. There was much bigger crises afoot, particularly the global financial collapse, which I always talk about. And we managed to break free of Great Britain, get to our farm, and now we're here basically digging down deep and getting ourselves prepared for what comes next, Monica.
So I have a question about the connection between understanding finance and making money, because I was an investment banker and I got an economics undergrad. I mean, I'm a chartered financial analyst. I have a CFA, which is like, I should know everything there is to know. Yet I find that the analysis of that stuff doesn't always yield. I mean, the smartest guys in the room can bring entire hedge funds down to their knees and go bankrupt. And it seems to me that a lot of the reason why it's not predictable is that it's not about understanding relationships or fundamentals. There's so much stuff going on behind the scenes that you can't factor in. Yes, there are millions of variables, but there are some variables that greatly outweigh all the other that you may not even know exist, much less how they're being manipulated. Whereas like congressmen have an outsized, beta or whatever, they make more money than most people. And for a long time, I mean, the law has changed, but for a long time, they could invest in things that they knew policy changes were coming down the road. And that kind of impact. I mean, personally, I don't even think insider trading should be illegal, because if people just were aware that it really happened, it would change our behavior. Making it illegal makes us think it doesn't really happen. But I think those are the kind of transactions that make it almost impossible to really just analyze in good faith and make a profit. And it's almost harder the better you understand it, seems to me. So I'm curious to know if you did actually make money doing it, or if you just made you run faster to the woods.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we kind of started to really get up to speed on things towards the end of this last big cycle. All this liquidity was sloshing around. So I'm talking like the mid 2014, 15, those kind of times. And I guess once you understand the monetary system, if you come from a historic perspective, what you realize is that we're essentially just living in a giant Ponzi scheme, and that the financial markets themselves are purely a function of liquidity. And what happens is the more liquidity that is available in the markets, the more things go up. It's really simple. It's that simple. And the things that go up the most are the most speculative assets. So that'd be things like tech stocks. And of course, in recent years, it was cryptocurrencies. However, if you're also looking at the bigger picture, I'm talking about money from a historical perspective. What is money? And you realize that what we have today is not money. It's just purely credit. And then once you look behind the curtain at what is actually going on behind there, and you see all of this debt, what you actually do is you don't want to put any money in those markets. And if you do, you're doing it very tentatively. So in many ways, what happens, Monica, is you don't earn a lot of money, but you don't lose a lot of money. And when the bad time comes, and everyone around you is getting wiped out, because we only really find out who's investing well in the bad times. You need to go through the full cycle. During the good times, what you often see is lots and lots of people leveraging up and getting huge outsized returns, and that is purely because there's so much liquidity and they're taking on lots and lots of risk. But it's okay because the liquidity is there. However, once that liquidity gets pulled, which is what's happening right now globally, what you find is, as Warren Buffett famously put it, who was swimming without their trunks on, because you find out who was managing their risk. And as we're finding out now, lots of people were not managing risk, and there's people getting wiped out. However, what you'll often find then is the more conservative investors and people who are actually trying to invest for the long term, they are outperforming in the bad times. So whilst they do okay during the good times, don't get me wrong, I made some outsized returns on things like, understanding gold and silver miners, for example. However, what you find is in the bad times, you outperform massively. So when everyone else is dropping 50, 60, 70%, I'm still up for the year. So that's how it works. So it's just more conservative. But I'm not really interested personally, Monica, in earning lots of money. What I'm more interested in is having freedom and having a life of my choosing. So natural food, living close to nature. So really for me, the money was just a function to get to that point.
Yes, I was expressing distress actually to a priest who listens to the show. And I was like, every once in a while I'll make some investment and I'll lose the money. And it really drives me crazy. Like it really just makes me sick. And he's like, yeah, because you're being slothful. You're not working hard enough, whether you're not really adding value. I think he objects to the whole idea of financial speculation. But even if he didn't, unless you're actually putting the work in night and day to follow, say, a stock or an industry or whatever, unless you have a very long time horizon, which isn't probably what you want, given that you actually need financing to buy chickens and stuff, land, that it is actually it is a full-time job. So maybe there are day traders and gamblers and stuff where it's easy money, but I never really thought it was. But yes, and what you said earlier about poverty wasn't an issue for you because you were enjoying what you were doing. I absolutely think that it's actually, I believe it's a trap where they get you to focus on money, they get you to translate all of your effort into money. They meaning in this case governments, subsidize infrastructure, transportation, so that you take that cost out of transactions in the marketplace, out of entertainment outside the home, out of working, away from home longer hours. Whereas if you had to pay for all that transportation, you would probably often prefer to just stay home with your kids. If these things weren't subsidized, you would make different choices. Even the tiniest bit of subsidy has an impact in aggregate on society and on individual choices. So I love and totally agree that you could really do without money entirely if you do what you love. And I think stuff like the homesteading is much more satisfying and creative and intellectual than people will give credit to. And that's how I felt about motherhood. That was supposed to be something that just kind of fell out automatically. You're not supposed to worry about it. You should go out and work. And it's not an easy job. It's very engaging. And if I had thought about it as a real career or occupation, probably would have been a little better prepared. But I think that you are smart enough to know that what you're doing is not only practical, but very rewarding, from what I gather.
Yeah, for sure. And in many ways, Monica, it came purely out of necessity too, although I always liked living like that anyways. Although I had a job in the city, I was living on my boat, and I love that self-sufficiency, that freedom, that independence, having control over my own energy, having a good food store, and this comes from a severe lack of trust in central authorities. That's where it comes from. Excuse me. So that's really where it stems from. But fundamentally, where this all revolves around right now is the understanding of what money actually is. And this is something that most people don't have. And I think if they did, and if they understood just how broken this current system is, and just how close we are to the end of it, and also then if they could foresee what's going to happen next, they would be scrambling to get as much self-sufficiency and independence now as possible. Because once this one goes, Monica, it's really going to be a cataclysm. It's going to be something that has never happened before in history. And it's going to be on the scale of the worst events in history. It's going to make COVID look like fun. When they locked us all down, all that stuff, that was just a warm-up for what's coming next. In many ways, they were actually psychologically preparing people for the kind of controls they're going to have to bring in once the monetary system starts to drop. So really, it's out of necessity why we're here as well, not just for fun.
Why do you believe that this will be that level of cataclysm? Because I have approached all this stuff academically for so long. They'll tell you you can predict patterns unless there's a paradigm shift, and people are always constantly trying to decide whether this cycle represents a paradigm shift, or if you can just keep your seat and things will come back. And there's always Dr. Doom. Is it Mark Faber? And some people say it about Peter Schiff, he predicted 7 out of the last 5 recessions, which is a joke. But what convinces you that this is such a cataclysmic, we're on the precipice of a cataclysm? And are you talking 5 years or 15 years or 50 years? Because if it's that historical, 50 years is the precipice. But yeah, I think you're thinking something sooner.
No, I think it's going to be sooner. In fact, I think we're already in it. And I think if I could explain it a little bit, then it would probably make sense. But what I see is that I frame things quite differently. So I say that we're already in World War III. So that's one thing that I put out there, is that began in 2019. And the reason it's World War III is because we have a rising superpower in China that's now formed a collective with the BRICS community. They're trying to de-dollarize. If they de-dollarize, that brings down the current monetary system by default. So right there, you've got one threat of the current monetary system coming down, because the US, basically the dollar is the global reserve currency. And once that ends, the US hyperinflates the dollar, because all the dollars flood back to the US, and that'll be the end of the dollar.
But we accelerated that by pushing Russia out of SWIFT. Like, why would we do that?
Yeah, so what the US is trying to do is it's essentially its war strategy is multifaceted. So of course we've got a hybrid war today. It's not like World War II where we've just got millions of men going out to die in Europe. What we've actually got is an information war. We've got cyber war. We've got kinetic war. We've got biological warfare, Monica, and that's a big one.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've also got economic war. And the economic war is what the US is enacting towards Russia, along with the proxy war. But the economic side of this is trying to essentially bring down Russia. And the reason they want to bring down Russia is so that they can install US oligarchs, it'll be Russian oligarchs in there that will be sensitive to the US's needs. Then the US, therefore, will encircle China, because Russia shares a southern border with northern China. Then China's completely surrounded. They've got Taiwan, they've got South Korea, they've got Japan and that to the east. And therefore, they can move on to China. So this is why Russia is so important, because if you control Eurasia through Russia, you essentially then control all of Europe. You pretty much control Africa, because you've got the gateway to Africa there, and then you can control the east too. So the US is essentially enacting the Third World War, the same as the British did. The British enacted war against the rising economic and industrial superpower of Germany. It did this twice over 2 wars. It eventually lost. However, it did defeat Germany, although the US stepped in at the last minute and became the next superpower because Britain was spent. However, the Germans got knocked out. Then it was Russia and the US, and the US knocked out Russia in the Cold War. However, Russia has returned. Now, it's nowhere close to the might to take on the US, but what it can do is team up with China and Iran and Brazil and form a coalition, and that's exactly what they've done. And Russia's actually the economic strategist in all of this. They're the ones that came up with this new monetary system that the BRICS are trying to enact. And like I said, if the BRICS manage to enact that new monetary system, US hegemony is over in a heartbeat. It's gone. So this is why the US is being forced to act. And the only problem the US has is they have this global Ponzi scheme debt system that is about to implode. So they've got something chasing it. And therefore, what's going to happen first? Are they going to be successful in bringing down Russia and then moving on to China? Or is this whole system going to collapse and force the US to retreat home to focus on the huge problems that will emerge once this system comes down?
I don't know where do you know what Russia's debt is right now as a percentage of its GDP? I mean, ours is whatever.
60%. So it's about half of what the US is.
60. Okay. Because I remember when I think it's long-term capital management collapsed, having bet on Russian debt that Russia did not repay. If I recall that correctly, they defaulted, and that I think it was long-term capital management. And then for the longest time, Russia had like 13% debt because I don't know if it's because their credit was bad or what. And I remember thinking, people would say, the US needs to have a good credit rating. And my thinking was, if the US were no longer able to access capital markets, we would have hope. There would be some chance. But the way that they have accelerated this debt. And then, do you mind if I take just a little side question on the US debt?
No, go for it.
Okay. So
sorry, if I call you Mon, it's because my wife's called Monica too, and I always call her Mon.
Yeah, and plus anybody in England, Mon, like you cannot say a whole name.
All the nicknames for my wife.
So yes, feel free to be familiar. So the US debt is so tremendous, and I thought I have been thinking that if that the debt reaching the levels that it is, which absolutely cannot be repaid within the paradigm, maybe even within the existing paradigm, maybe not even the interest, if the interest rates are normalized, which they are. Like I'm just worried about them rolling over the 30 trillion they have right now in a rising interest rate environment. And I sometimes I think they're doing this collapse on purpose because that will usher in the CBDC. And then other times, I think that the whole reason for COVID and everything else was that they wanted to, they had to inflate the money supply because it really had collapsed in 2001 and then 2008 again, basically. And they were just kicking the can on that with zero interest rates, even though, 10 years into an expansion so I don't know if they didn't actually want this debt, but the only way to have a debt-based currency like this is to keep expanding the debt. Not totally clear on that. I mean, my gut is telling me that they did it on purpose in order to stimulate a collapse or call for the CBDC. What's your position on that?
Yes, I think that's exactly what's happened. I mean, it all goes back to what is money, doesn't it? Because what we've got today isn't money. Basically, we've got IOUs that are debt. So it's credit, and every piece of paper is an IOU. So that's the bank. When you get money out of the bank, you've got an IOU from the central bank. If you put your money in the bank as a deposit, and I'm saying money, but what I really mean is currency. If you put your money in the bank, then you have loaned it to the bank. And now the bank's going to lend that out, and there's counterparties everywhere. Now, if you look at global debt, we've got over 300 trillion, but that's on the books. What we also have is a ton of global debt in things like derivatives. Now, derivatives are just toxic financial products where you don't even own an underlying asset. You have an asset somewhere, but it's not yours and it's not mine. But we start to make all kinds of trades and bets around the asset. Now, currently, they think there's around 2 to 4 quadrillion of these derivatives. And because of the hyper-financialization of the markets that happened post-1971, what we've got now is everything is so interlinked and everything is tied together. And this is where we get to this, why do I think it's going to collapse? Everything's so interlinked, Monica, that all that has to happen now is for one financial institution to go under and a domino effect happens. And then all of a sudden it spreads throughout the system. Now, we already saw this in 2008. We've seen this a number of times in between. However, what we haven't seen is this happen at the moment where we've got all of this debt post QE. And of course, we're close to it because we almost had the UK pension fund start to go under recently. And again, it would have been a systemic collapse. The central bank had to step in. So really what we've got now is they are sacrificing the currencies. And that's the end game scenario. Once they have to start sacrificing the currencies and you get to high inflation, then hyperinflation, that's the last chance saloon. So that's where we are now. So that's why there's no going back on this one, Monica. It's because inflation's here and everything that they did previously through quantitative easing has now made its way through the system to the point where all that debt has gone up from the public level to the central bank. And once you're at the central bank, there's nowhere else to go. All you can do is sacrifice the currency.
Okay. I'm surprised at how well they seem to manage it, though. Like in 2008, I think Henry Paulson, who was, I guess, the Treasury Secretary at the time, he went before Congress and literally panicked the market and panicked Congress and did not allow, I think, was it Barclays that wanted to buy Lehman or Bear Stearns? Like there were a couple that went under, Lehman and Bear Stearns, I think. When Barclays wanted to buy it, he wouldn't allow it. And then later, I think they did, but only after the collapse created this panic. So I kind of felt like it was more stable than he even wanted us to believe. But is that just a wrinkle in the cloth? Do you feel like it really was all going to collapse? Because I feel like he stimulated that.
Yeah, I think when you look back at the story of 2008, they were clearly in dire straits there, but they did have options still available to them. And the quantitative easing option and taking interest rates down to zero was a classic model to follow. So they've done this before. It happened post-World War II. And it works for a time. However, the only problem there is in the next crisis, you have nowhere to go because what you've already done is you've took the interest rates down to zero. So you don't have that lever of power anymore over the monetary system. And of course, the big problem is all of this liquidity that was going into the system. Sorry, excuse me. All of that liquidity found a home, and it found a home in assets, and it created bubbles everywhere. Now, again, in the global economy as it stands now, we're so hyper financialized that what that means is that all of your pension systems in the next crisis will go down with it. So then who pays for that? You know what I mean? Because they're all invested in the stock market. They're all invested in government bonds. Government bonds are negative yielding.
Right.
The stock market's in a massive bubble. It's starting to deflate. But if we go back to some of the just take a average decline in the stock market during a major bear market, you're talking 70%. We've got a long, long way still to go. We're talking like crypto type losses. And, you know, if you look at the crypto market and people who are overexposed to that, they're in dire straits now and they're in despair. Well, that is going to come. And then the pension system goes. So then how do we fund the people in their old age? The only way to do that, Monica, would be to print money. And if you print money now, you're actually printing real money that's going into the economy. It's not just sitting on balance sheets. Then you have massive inflation. So that's why we're in this death spiral now, where the only thing left is a hyperinflation. Sorry, my throat's a bit sore today.
That's okay.
The only thing left is a hyperinflationary event.
So, hold on. I'm going to ask you this question. How do I believe that the super money people, even people who aren't like insiders, maybe not people who aren't insiders, but I mean, there is an echelon that will be protected, right? Or do you think even the people who, I mean, I feel like Paulson brought down the system just to save his friends at Goldman or whatever, like quite possibly. So when they bring, you know, is that echelon going to be protected, or are we going to have like a total collapse at all levels? I mean, who will be saved?
Well, there is an elite moneyed class that have always existed, and they will 100% be saved. So you're talking about the old monarchies of Europe. You know, they're all trillionaires. Off paper, they're all trillionaires if you account for their art collections, their jewel collections, their collections of land and palaces, their rights, Monica. So they've got rights. For example, if you take the royal family in Great Britain, they have rights to all of the seabeds around the UK, any treasure that's found in the UK. He owns all of the properties in Cornwall. If you die in the UK and there's no heir to your house, it goes back to the crown. So just in the laws alone, they're worth probably quadrillions, because those kind of laws you couldn't buy. You know, they entitled them to permanent wealth. They also own all of the lands of Canada legally, all of the lands of Australia. So that's just the monarchies of Europe. They're all billion to trillionaires. And that because they already own all of the wealth. They own the hard assets, they own the jewels, they own the gold, silver, and whatnot. So they're going to be fine. Then, of course, you've got other moneyed classes. So we're talking about the old industrialists of Europe and America. So these will be the Rockefellers. Obviously, there's banking cartels too. They'll all be fine. And then beneath that, you've basically got the lackeys, and that's the politicians, that's the CEOs, and they're the ones that
enact bourgeoisie. Would you say it's the bourgeoisie? Yeah. I feel like either America doesn't have the concept or we're all bourgeois. Like, I don't know what exactly it means, but I always think that professional class, the merchant class, whatever. And I even look at vaccination rates and I'm like, you know, the more educated you are, the higher the vaccination rates. And I'm thinking, I think that's true. It wasn't the beginning. Like the more establishment educated you are. And I keep thinking like, maybe they are actually, I was like, that makes no sense to me. And I'm thinking maybe they're actually trying to take out middle management because they make too much for what they contribute, you know, metaphorically and literally. So is where
they'll always be okay, Monica, at that level, because essentially.
Oh, you think they will be okay?
Yeah, because it's just cronyism. So, you know, so long as you're
right, the political class is what you're saying.
Yeah, they'll all be fine because they'll get looked after in privileges. So no matter what the new system is, they'll immediately get access to, they'll be closest to the money. So they'll get the contracts.
This happened to us only recently, I feel like around the Obama time, when it really became where government connected rich were the elites here too, because for a long time you could just get rich here anyway and survive. But something happened. There was a tipping point, and I feel like, that if you're connected and you have the information, they call you on the phone. I remember the whole Paulson thing. Like there were people on the other end of the phone call, guys I used to work for were in a room with him one day, you know, and the next day he goes to Congress, and I'm thinking, well, those guys probably had a safety hatch. So, okay. Got it.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing that will change is if the current system implodes under its own weight, under its debt. Like I said, we're talking, the US has got 40 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So if somebody can explain to me how they're going to manage that without either killing most of the people, so to get rid of the burden, or to actually print the money to actually give them. And then obviously that devalues the currency for everyone. So essentially they'll be getting peanuts. So again, either way, it doesn't work. You've got an impoverished class there in old age. Yeah. So there's that, whichever way you spin the coin on this one, there's no actual way to do it besides just going back to monetary history and realizing that there is a way. They've always done it the same way. It ends in a hyperinflation. Every fiat currency has. Every global reserve currency has come to an end after around 90 to 100 years. That's what's happening with the US dollar. So, the historic... I guess the way you'd have to look at this, Monica, if you wanted to come up with an argument for it not happening that way, is you have to believe we've transcended history. Like the same way we've transcended biology and science.
Well, the only thing that gives me hope, though, is not long-term hope. I understand what you're saying completely, but as that they are not ready for this yet, that they're kicking the can, and I firmly believe that this past 2 years, the number one reason for them rolling this out at this time was because they had that zero interest rate problem. And they're actually buying some time by bringing those interest rates back up. And I don't know if that's going to, maybe create a severe recession. That's what people are worried about. But it seems to me that they're going for another round.
Yeah, see, this is what happened in Great Britain recently. So the raising of interest rates basically triggered a crisis in the derivatives market, because what it transpired was a lot of pension funds are using derivatives to manage their bond portion of the portfolio. So as interest rates rose rapidly and inflation was rising too, it essentially meant they got huge margin calls, because remember, derivatives are a debt instrument, so there's counterparties. So what happened was the commercial banks started to give huge amount margin calls to the pension funds. The pension funds said, we're going to go bust, we can't meet the margin calls. Then the commercial banks and investment banks who were giving them these derivatives said, we're going to go bust too, because we're not going to get what's owed to us. And then the central bank had to step in and basically bail everyone out. Now, if the central bank hadn't have bailed everyone out, Monica, what you'd have seen is the whole of UK banking would have collapsed within a few weeks, because the counterparties in the system are so massive now that everyone is on the hook for everyone else's loss. So this is where you get to that concept of too big to fail. However, the only way to fix it is to print the money. And then you get to the point where we are now, where in the UK, they're saying we've got around 10% inflation, but it's around 30% in actual inflation in terms of what you're paying if you go to get fuel, if you're paying your energy bills, if you're buying food, you're talking 30, 40, in some cases even higher. So that's the problem, is all of the money printing is now showing up in inflation. And that's only going to spiral. There's actually no way to fix that now. And yeah, so this is, again, wherever you look, at some point, the system's so fragile, at some point something breaks and they can't fix it. Or if they do, they have to sacrifice the currency completely, which is the death of currency.
The pound trading at whatever, $1.15 or something, is just, unthinkable to me. Like, I could see from that perspective, thinking that the entire system was circling the drain, but we're on the other side of that. So it doesn't feel as imminent. But also, even like if they didn't actually bail them out, I think we're still at the point where they could just say they're going to, and that would be a credible statement. But once that's not a credible statement, then you actually couldn't even do it if you tried. And I think that's, until people, I think they can probably tread water until they really lose the confidence. I mean, that is the ultimate, the fiat currency is ultimately a con game. You need confidence in it, and that may change. And yeah, you're right. I mean, you look at every system comes to an end, especially when it's not based on anything. Okay, so you're confident in that, and how do you approach dealing with that personally? And also, I mean, that pretty much is the end of what you're, that's the fact, right? Like, this is what you expect from the currency the currency collapse is going to be the end of this system. I assume you expect us to move into the CBDC as like the new dollar. Like when this happens in South America and stuff, when they abandon a currency, they'll roll out the new peso. You know, they'll roll out the new whatever. So the CBDC, I assume, will be the new dollar, right
Yeah,
after the collapse.
that's what I believe they're trying to get to right now, Monica. However, they're nowhere close to it. I know there's a lot of discussion around it. They're doing experiments in many different countries. So the Bahamas has had a CBDC called the Sand Dollar. Nigeria had a CBDC. So they're experimenting. And make no mistake, when we look to the Bahamas, they haven't chosen to do that. They've been chosen to be a test subject. That's how it's happening. Same in Nigeria. You know, but the Bahamians have no desire for a CBDC. They're a tiny island with a tiny economy. So it's really just a test run. And that's what they're doing across the world right now. But they're a long way away from it. And the problem the US and the West in general has is the system's so fragile, it's threatening to collapse at any moment. So there's this gap here now, this integrum where what's going to happen if it comes down and we can't fix it? We can't just print the money because it hyperinflates and then we have a chain, a domino effect of hyperinflations. What do we do then? So then you'll have this period of chaos. And what will happen there if you wake up and you're told that your pension's gone? What's going to happen if you can't draw money out of the bank because the money's worthless? Remember, in Europe, in the US, and in Canada, they've already set up for bank bail-ins. So that means if the banking system starts to collapse, they're going to take it from the depositees. So that's already actually been written in. That came in after 2008. So after the European banking crisis, they did this in Cyprus, and they're doing it right now in Lebanon. They're taking the money from the depositors' accounts, and they're saying, right, we're going to take that money and bail out the bank, and we're going to give you some worthless fiat currency that's been hyperinflated. So essentially, you're getting like a 99% haircut on your deposits. So this is already all in legislation. So what's going to happen in that world if people wake up and they can't access the bank? Supply chains are breaking down because nobody can pay one another because the money's worthless. So how do the suppliers pay the wholesalers? How does the wholesaler pay their workers? You know, everything ceases to work. So then you've got a real civilization collapse type moment. And what you'll need in that kind of environment is the government to step in and control everything. So they'll lock people down. They'll have QR codes, what you can go and get some rations. It'll be a real nightmare dystopia. However, if you look at what happened in 2020 and 2021, they basically did a test run of what that world would look like. You know, everyone was dependent on the government. All shops were closed. You could go to the supermarket. However, I don't know what it was like where you was, Monica, but in the UK, you was limited to buying 3 goods. You basically would just expand out a little bit further and it would look somewhat similar. So in my opinion, they're already doing a test run for this ultimate crisis, which will be the financial one. Now, like I said, their goal is to get to CBDCs fast, to kick the can down the road long enough to be able to do some kind of controlled demolition and some kind of smooth changeover. However, you will still have to destroy what currently exists because you can't take 4 quadrillion of debt of derivatives across to a new system. You can't take 300 trillion of debt across to the new system or 40 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And because we live in a global system, you've got all of these other countries as well. So they're not going to accept, for example, if you're Chile, you're not going to accept worthless fiat money for your copper. You're going to, whoa, wait a minute. I'm keeping my copper because that's worth something. So it's not just a case of trading the old system for a new system. It's also a case of having a new, coming together and designing a new system that people are going to want to participate in. Now, at present, the US gets to enforce its will because of the dollar. So people have to give the US stuff and it can give them worthless dollar because they need that to pay for commodities. And there's also a lot of dollar denominated debt. But you think about it, Monica, if this current system comes down, the US no longer has that ace card up its sleeve. It can't do that. So then all of a sudden, countries have to start putting up things of value again to trade with one another. It won't go back to being a fiat standard is my point. So then you've got to have some whole discussion and somebody has to lead that. You know, post World War II, it was the US, but in this new system, who's going to be the leader? And that's why World War III comes in. It's setting up for deciding who's going to rule the next system.
You kind of blew my mind there for a second. So we got to rewind that one sentence. The way I visualize or intuit, I guess, the CBDC is it's a central bank digital currency. It's digital. You have nothing in your hand. It's as far from gold or anything of value that I can imagine. And now you're telling me that either before that or alongside that, we are going to have to return to something, basically akin to a gold standard, right? Where countries would like ship gold across the ocean to make up for balance of payments deficits and stuff. I think it's so that's or like a barter system, really, right? Like go back to just either a medium of exchange or just trade like real things. They could do it that way. But yeah, that's kind of blows my mind because I hadn't thought of it that way. Now that would be before they can implement a CBDC, or would it have to be alongside?
See, this is actually already happening, Monica. So what we're seeing in the BRICS countries right now is their new system is actually based on commodity-backed money, although it's going to be a digital money. So pretty much a central bank digital currency. However, it's not just going to be a sovereign currency. This is going to be like a new reserve asset. So basically a replacement for the US dollar. And what's going to happen is all of the countries that are a part of the new monetary system will have to back their portion of the new currency with commodities. And then their portion will get put into a pot and it will be weighted based on things like GDP, on population size. So, for example, let's go back to Chile. If you're Chile and you're a part of the new system, you'll have your currency in the basket. And like I said, this will be a reserve asset that countries trade between one another. But you'll put your currency in the basket, but you'll have to back it. So for Chile, they might say, right, we're going to put copper and gold in there. And we're going to keep ours backed. Let's say 20% of our currency is backed by copper and gold. Then that has to remain in an audited vault somewhere or underground or wherever. Russia might say we're going to back ours with gold, platinum, and oil and gas because we've got a ton of that. So, of course, that makes Russia extremely powerful in the system. And it means that these commodity nations can leapfrog many of the Western nations. So you start to see why this is so devastating to the West and why it would completely reorder the global power structures. And China, of course, will lead that new system by default because China has secret gold holdings around 30,000 tons, we think. So in this new system, gold is going to be key as well. That's already been listed as one of the commodities that they're going to use in it. China's got a ton of gold. It also has a lot of other resources as well, though, Monica. So you can already start to see why the West has to go to war to stop this system coming into being, because the moment it does, the West is done for, essentially.
Yeah, I've been seeing a shoring up for a while. And I remember when Trump came in and he started talking about like trade barriers and returning manufacturing to the US. And I think, I had been thinking, I don't know if I think this anymore, that everything was controlled from the top and they coordinated, the international elite coordinated even across China and Russia, because there is some coordination. Like there was coordination during Event 201. And, they all have vax, although some are conventional and some aren't. But I remember thinking, what it seems like he's doing is getting us on a war footing, like implementing autarky, like Mussolini said, like you have to have everything produced yourself. And now I even still see that with how they're dealing with the very, very high end, like AI level chips, the like Taiwan Semiconductor chip manufacturing company, and our issues with Taiwan. Even the coup in Bolivia, I think, was about I think the president wanted to start building battery power plants, battery manufacturing facilities there because they have a lot of lithium. Is it lithium? And then I guess the US, or I don't know who's behind Tesla, Musk, the Rand Corporation, I don't know who's behind it, but does not want the batteries produced in outside place. They want to get all the commodities under control or control the governments that have that, so that there's obviously a polarization happening where they're trying to amass actual real things like manufacturing and commodities. And that fits right with what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, and it's also about how we frame it. We have to recognize that we've been conditioned and indoctrinated to believe the world works in a certain way and to have certain paradigms. So one of them is that we have these nations battling one another. And it's true, but it's no more true than it was in, say, World War I and World War II, when you had US and British, well, the British Central Bank was funding Germany in the build-up to World War II. We had all the US corporations funding the German industrialists during the build-up to World War II. During World War II, we had the Bank of International Settlements taking gold and moving it around for Germany. That could have stopped the war right there if they just refused. The Bank of International Settlements was formed post-World War One. So post-World War One to handle war reparations. So when you pick it apart, you see that the elites are always interlocked and they don't care who wins the war. And the same thing's happening now. You've got the elites there and basically they're arguing over the cake, who's going to get the biggest slice. But we will all lose. But the elites in China, the elites in the US, they're all basically beholden to the same monetary class. And that's the hidden class that you don't see. That's the intergenerational wealth, the ultra elite bankers, the ones whose names you probably don't even know. And
does that include the monarchy?
Oh, absolutely. In my opinion, yeah. I mean, it was King Charles, as we call him now. It was King Charles who actually got the honor of announcing the Great Reset. And like I said, if you look at, you've got to remember all of his wealth is actually tied up in the West, however. So, they're all quite anxious too, because they're realizing that there's changes in the West. So they've tried to consolidate their power through something like the WEF. Because remember, although the monarchies of Europe are still attached to countries somewhat, really, the elites in the old elites, let's call them the old money, I call them. So it's the old money of Europe. Really, their power is not beholden to any one country. They might be situated in a country like King Charles is in the UK, and you've got, say, Queen Beatrice in Holland. However, their money interests are essentially just transnational. They're all across the world. They just reside in a country, and all of these elites have come together in like the WEF, and that's basically like their political arm. That's the one that's kind of moving the pieces around the board for them, because they can't do it through the sovereign level, through the government, because they're meant to be autonomous. So instead, they've almost kind of created this separate group. We're going to do it behind the scenes here. However, the WF is acting in the interest of all of the elites of the West, in my opinion, personally.
Okay, I got it. That's just an awesome way of explaining this stuff. And that's what I love about the fact that you educated yourself on this, is that you started from not having a background in finance, right? Is that correct?
No background in finance. Besides my childhood background in seeing lots of money around.
Yes. No, I was going to say, you think outside the box probably because you saw that. And my guess is your family didn't revere the establishment and such. But the fact that you had to come at it from the outside and understand it as a layman is probably why you do understand it in the big picture, and like that you can explain it. Because when people start getting into the derivative stuff, it's very easy to be derailed, because at a certain point, now I always think anything that man creates, man can explain, that man can understand. But if you really try to do the maths behind some of that derivative stuff, like I think that it gets to the point where it's too much. It would be too much to really intuit. So, but you got to stay out of the weeds. And I appreciate how you're explaining it. And I think that's a valid point, because one thing I always kind of had been struggling with a lot was, where does the competition end and the conspiracy begin? And I think I'm starting to get a more nuanced view of that. Yes, I think the international elite will, the members of that, the intergenerational wealth will remain at that highest tier, but some sharing of power that goes on at that level will benefit or not benefit some more than others. So if the West were to, I feel like, I do believe that the Western powers, US, UK, whatever, we're trying to create a global hegemony. And at, kind of recently, maybe Ukraine was the tipping point, like the 2014 Ukraine was the tipping point where they were like, okay, we're not actually going to control Russia and China. And if we have a world market, they could compete with us there. So maybe let's try to polarize it now, try to renew the old Cold War and see if we can at least cordon off our market, which I'm not convinced they're going to be able to do, which is why I think they're trying to make sure that China doesn't get those chips and stuff. But, I'm always just trying to figure out the big picture. And I think you have a handle on it, which is why it kind of scares me that you're like moved to Poland, right? like, wow, he is out.
Yeah.
So this might be a good time for you to tell us like why Poland, and you've really cracked the code on the finance stuff, and I can only imagine that you've cracked the code on your own life. So why Poland?
Yeah, so just a quick comment on what you said. So I think one thing we have to recognize is that the US has done a fantastic job on enacting its strategy, because really the US is in a win-win situation right now. If it doesn't defeat Russia and it doesn't enact it, it's like, okay, Ukraine's fighting Russia, but you know what I'm saying when I say that. If the US doesn't succeed over there in this proxy war, then what happens? Well, it's destroyed European energy and essentially turned Europe into a tributary system now. So the Europe has to get all of its food from the US. Europe has to get all of its energy and gas imported through LNG. So the US has created a new empire for itself, and that's cemented now. There's no escaping that for Europe. Europe's done for. It has to be dependent wholly on the US. And it's similar to what the monarchs used to do. They used to go around the world, invade a country, and then make it dependent on them. And they had to pay tribute. They had to send taxes back, or they had to give them produce. Well, that's what's happening now. So the US has got like a second place prize there for itself. If it doesn't stay hegemon, it still gets to rule the Western Bloc.
We have to pause there for a second, and I hope you don't mind that I'm going to hold you way over. I said if you've done an hour, there's no chance.
No, it's fine. I've got plenty of time.
Okay, so there's one person I blame for that, and you're never going to guess who it is.
No, go for it.
Like, I'm not even sure I pronounced his name correct. Olaf Scholz.
Olaf, the German. Yeah.
Yeah. Right? Because Merkel wouldn't do it. She would not alienate Russia. She wouldn't shut down the Nord Stream pipelines. But the reason I even just am saying it like that, because I just think it's funny, because he doesn't even know. He seems like an idiot. So is that, why are they so stupid to fall for our nonsense? Like, when I was in England recently, and just last week, when I see Ukraine flags over there, I'm thinking, are you stupid? Like, I understand why we're doing it. We're completely insulated on every level. We're gas independent. You're going to buy our liquefied natural gas at like many times the amount. And we've got beef, but it does, when the missiles start flying, like, we're not there. And that they have fallen for it across Europe. So every once in a while I see that there are protests in Europe about Ukraine. I'm like, I assume they're protesting against sending more money over there, against alienating Russia. Yet you never hear that. I mean, why are they falling for that?
Yeah, well, it's the power of the US. I mean, not just political power. We're talking hidden power, economic power. Of course, they pretty much control Western finance, or they've at least got the biggest seat at the table in the IMF and in the World Bank. Then you've also got the information war. Most of the content comes out of America. Most of the internet is in English, and the US has supreme power over there. US intelligence is the most powerful. US military, you know what I mean? They really are a global hegemon, the only truly global hegemon we've ever had. And that gives them all the levers of power. And, when it comes to politicians, what really are politicians? They're just at best some kind of muddling middle managers who get told what to do. So, if they get the right person into power, some Olaf Scholz, I mean, come on.
I know. I'm not saying he was the mastermind, but all they had to do was get the right puppet, and they do that on purpose. But I read a 2019 Rand Corporation document, which was like, so should we, how should we handle Belarus? We should give them a chance to come over to our side. Otherwise, we'll just send protests over there. It'll be fine. And should we provoke Russia to invade Ukraine? I mean, it would distract them from some of the other things, but we could build a bridge, but let's just see what happens. Let's just say let's just push it more towards NATO, and let's just tweak them a little bit and see if they come to the table. And if there's a war, that's fine too. It's crazy. And it came from the Rand Corporation. I mean, I'm not saying that, like, obviously that's the US military, and I don't even think that's the top of the pyramid over here, but they certainly
did. Even in 1996, though, Monica, you had US geostrategists like Zbigniew Brzezinski talking about going into
He's
Ukraine.
Polish.
Yeah. Well, he's Polish origin. Yeah,
No, I'm just
I don't
kidding.
know if he's revered over here or despised. I'm not sure, but yeah. So he was even talking in his book, The Grand Chessboard, in 1996, about how Ukraine's going to become the key centerpiece of the new chessboard. Russia's going to eventually rise up. The US is going to have to face Russia. I mean, this was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So the US has been orchestrating its grand strategy for a long, long time.
Yeah. So why Poland?
Well, the easiest answer is that my wife's Polish. So,
oh, lucky.
When we was deciding what to do, well, basically England is done for, in my opinion, Monica. And I'm very sad to say that as a British man, Englishman, not British, Englishman. And
yes,
my great granddad fought in both of the wars. He fought in the first one as a 15-year-old boy. He fought in the Second World War as an elderly man. He survived both wars. He volunteered in both wars. He didn't have to go in either.
That's rare.
Yeah, very rare.
Fight in both of them.
Yeah, exactly. So, to what I lived in, I saw Great Britain basically go from when I was a child to being a semi-functioning, decent country, still had community, to essentially being decimated over the short span of, let's say, 25, 30 years. This was through things such as mass migration. Again, my wife was a migrant. I've got nothing wrong with migrants, but we all know what's happening in places like the UK and certain European places.
I mean, London was so multicultural or whatever. Like you could hardly hear English on the street, and my impression was they whatever Chucky 3 offered up that city to the world. It was sacrificed to the world. It's just the borders were thrown, and I love it. It's a really cool place. I enjoy it. It's functioning. It's rich. It's whatever, but it's not English.
Yeah, see, the real problem that happened in the UK was, like, over the last 20 years, we've seen a 4- or 5-fold increase in knife crime, a 4- or 5-fold increase in sexual assaults and rapes, 5-fold increase in violent assaults on the street. So, that country, well, the collective of countries is in a real mess. And, right now we've got a huge problem. It's a real big national scandal, because what's happening is so many migrants are being shipped across now post-Brexit. And they're putting them up in countries hotels up and down the country. So this is in the UK. So it's also across the pond there in Ireland. And the people are saying, we don't want this. Like, we don't want this in our community. I mean, I've got family members who live in wealthy, affluent areas. It's happening there. The entire hotel cancelled all the
That's
bookings,
intentional.
Cancelled all the weddings, Monica, for the next year, and have flooded it with hundreds and hundreds of young migrant men from different cultures, don't speak the language.
Without work.
You know what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen, because we've already seen the consequences over 20 years. So that's me.
Who's getting first on those boats are the people who do not have strong ties to their communities. You know what I mean? You're not getting the super stable family man to migrate.
No. And I mean,
it's a self-selected process, and they're doing it intentionally, putting them in places where they wouldn't otherwise be, because it's very disruptive to the culture. And the more your culture is disrupted, the more your safety nets erode, and the more you have to look to the government for help.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think it is. I think it's creating this. It's basically going to result in this next stage of terrorization of the citizens. At some point, something will trigger mass riots. There'll be lootings, there'll be people smashing up shops in the street. I mean, we just saw this in Belgium recently over the last week, because Morocco won a football game in the World Cup.
With a Belgian at the helm, right?
Yeah,
I was there.
Basically, they were smashing up the city. They were burning cars. And this was a celebration. This wasn't even a negative.
That's what happens when things go well.
Yeah, so exactly. So I mean, the Europeans have been really dragged through the mud these past 2 or 3 decades. And one of the reasons we came to Poland was actually because they were one of the only countries who resisted that. Poland had pretty much kept its culture. It accepted millions of Ukrainians, but Ukrainians are fairly culturally compatible. In fact, most Polish people have some kind of heritage over there with Ukraine. They'll have some family member that at some point was in Ukraine, as is the case in the Baltics. So, one of the reasons we came here is because it's safe. It's a Catholic country. It lines up with our own values. And that threat of migration was much lower, and because, like I said, I used to actually work in those communities where we had lots and lots of children that were trafficked by migrant men who had come across. So sexual trafficking. We're talking over the past 30 years, Monica, 200,000 to 400,000 children, predominantly white children from working class backgrounds. So this isn't just the UK. There's been similar things that have happened across Europe. So, I actually worked in those communities, and I said, I will never raise my child in the UK because you're essentially feeding them to the wolves over there. The state over there has completely lost all compassion or care for people that are from that, people that would have been classed as native British people. So like you said, it's kind of been turned over to this ideology of multiculturalism, and that's great if that's what you want. But for me personally, I like, I've got friends from all kinds of cultures on my community on Patreon. I've got people who have immigrated to the UK, contributing to the UK. They love living there. That's fantastic. What we're talking about here is something slightly different. It's this basically just unrestricted migration, unvetted people flooding into the country.
Well, it's weaponized is what it is. I mean, it's intentional. Yeah. Because there's a book written, Weapons of Mass Migration. It's intentional. Like, I think they actually go into those they do not want the English culture or any culture. They don't want the cultures in the places they're coming from to survive. By taking away, you throw bombs on them, you corrupt their government, and then you take away their young men who, if they were staying, would work and contribute and put down their roots. Like my father fought in World War II, and my mother remembers World War II, and she said they took all the boys out of the small towns, they sent them over to Europe, and whether they came back or not, they never went back to the small towns. And that was the end of small town America. It was exactly that. And that's what they do to the foreign countries. We worry about what it does where we live, but it destroys their own countries as well. And it's intentional. And I think it's because they know that, they hate us. Big T, they hate us. Like King Charles does not love me or you. He has, his perspective is intergenerational and pyramidic, like he just doesn't think like this. And in his mind, like his father said, I'd like to come back as a virus and kill people, and in his mind, that's morality. So you have to understand, like this, they intentionally destroy us all by undermining, your family, your church, your community, your town, your country even is an extension of your family. And they just don't like that. And that's what they're doing. So interesting. Yes. So your wife is Polish and you're Catholic. I'm surprised to hear that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my views slightly more nuanced. I'm certainly not somebody who is a supporter of the institution of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah. So I'm a practicing Catholic, but I think Pope Francis drinks baby's blood. Like, I think he actually might drink baby's blood. So.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But the church is the people. It is not the Pope.
Yeah, exactly. That's a whole nother thing, isn't it? And I too believe that what we're seeing, I believe at the upper echelons there is a religiosity. Is that a word? There's a religious element to their belief system, and it is essentially biblical. However, it's Luciferian. So
it's inverted. Exactly.
It's taking the opposite position on this one. So, and I believe that is genuinely what we are facing. And if you look around at what's being done unto children, at what's happening in the mainstream media, and how they're kind of spinning this towards this really dystopian, dark, and it is quite child-focused as well, isn't it? What we're seeing with these ideologies. It really does hurt the youngest people the most, and that's what we're seeing. So I actually say it is a form of child sacrifice. We're sacrificing their futures, we're sacrificing their mental health, and
mutilate
in some cases,
mutilate them. I mean, the sex change thing is not, no matter what you think about it, it's not appropriate to determine prepubescent sexuality. It's not appropriate. It doesn't make sense. I mean, I know people of all sexual orientations didn't even know what their sexual orientation was until puberty. I mean, it's just,
you only have to take one look at libs of TikTok to see some of the videos that they collate of young people talking about how today their bug self, tomorrow their owl self, and it just screams mental health disorders. Yeah. I've worked with thousands of children with mental health disorders, and 10, 15 years ago, these would have been the children that I was working with. However, they wouldn't have been saying they were non-binary or they were changing gender. They would have been self-harming, or they would have been doing some other form of it would have come out in another way, is my point. Maybe they'd have got into alternative scenes of different types. It's just the thing that has been given to children as a reason for their torment and suffering. So, it's probably because of this. You know, they've been handed it, and it's been pushed on them from every angle right now.
That's really interesting, because I've always noticed that about race, about when I see programs and stuff that are targeting. I remember when I was younger, young Black women or Black teenage girls, like I was a teenage girl, and they would tap into insecurities that I had, but project, that they came from somewhere else. And I thought, if you tell somebody that, your lack of confidence is imposed on them from the outside world, and there's nothing they can ever do about it, how are they going to tell the difference between the stuff that you can do something about, stuff that's natural and insecure? I mean, I was just unbelievably insecure, just a young girl, a teenage girl. Like, it's just a terrible, thing to be. It's just a painful, scary place to be. And and I do remember an occasion or two when I fell for some, or was exposed to some, I'm going to call it a liberal message that, well, this is because you're oppressed because you're a female. And I remember thinking, like, I've never felt so desolate in my life, practically, than that. And so I never thought of the fact that they're using the sexual that I don't even know what to call it, their sexual identity as a reason, the underlying reason for you to have the insecurities that you have, when really the insecurities are developmentally normal.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. I mean, they're very difficult times, and now more than ever, because of devices and technology and the way the algos work to just lock people into scrolling over things that will really damage their mental health. Also, pornography is a huge one. That's one that was really a massive problem for a lot of the kids that I worked with. If they ever dared speak about it, it was always talking about how rotten it made them feel. That's really messing up kids' brains. So there's so much that kids are exposed to now, and it's the psychological threats are everywhere online. So yeah, this is a huge problem. And like I said, if you give a child a tailored, ready-made excuse or reason for their hardship and say, this is why it might be, have you thought about this? And then all of a sudden the algos latch onto that and start to feed all that content to them. Of course, they're going to be convinced, because they're young. They haven't developed that fully formed sense of self. They don't have their identity fully shaped. And, then all of a sudden you get these people essentially grooming them. That is the right word. They are being groomed into this ideology. Just as an example, Monica, before I left the UK, I was working with a young girl, and I came on to the case, let's say, right towards the end. And they said, oh, just so you know, this young girl, she was going to go through a sex change. She was going to change into a boy. I was like, oh, right, okay. And because all of this was just getting really big my last few years in my career in the UK. And when I met her, it turned out she was literally 2 weeks away from gender reassignment, 2 weeks. And she realized, actually, I'm a lesbian. She'd be, for 2 years, they'd been taking her to psychotherapists, mental health specialists, getting her all ready for this surgery. Everyone, you had to support it, Monica. That's the rule. Whether you're a psychologist, a teacher, a social worker, the rule is you are trained, you must affirm, you must support. So everyone did that. And of course, that pushed her along. 2 weeks out from mutilating her body for life, she realizes, actually, I'm a lesbian.
Not just mutilating the body for life, but becoming dependent on hormones. I mean, you can never go off the grid. Can you? Yeah. I have no idea what would happen to you if you had sex change and then stopped taking the hormones. I mean, if you had done all that stuff prepubescently, it's just genital mutilation, which the same people will say.
It's very interesting though, Monica. If you look into the gender reassignment clinic, the very first one in the UK, it was the Tavistock Centre. Now, that name might not mean a lot to you. However, it's essentially where MK Ultra came from. Yeah. It came from the experiments they were doing at the Tavistock Centre on people who had mental health issues back in the 50s. And it's no surprise that was the clinic where they first started doing the gender reassignments and the affirmation and all of this stuff. It actually started there. Now they've actually had to close it down because of this, because it's such a huge scandal.
Yeah, such a huge scandal. But I will also just mention that when this way of approaching your insecurities and all that you said it's just fed to them and they'll scroll, and it's fed. That also provides a language for these kids to talk to each other in something that they feel they can get their mind around, that they're not going out on a limb, exposing themselves. If they talk about their problems and insecurities in that language that's provided to them, that all their other kids or other kids in there, like birds of a feather kind of thing, all the kids in the group that are getting their particular tailored, because it's highly tailored also, but it really makes them feel like if they can get into that current, whatever it is, they're really searching for a sense of belonging, a sense of understanding, and this seems to provide that to them, but it's distorted. So, it's at least manipulative, if nothing more. And it's just that obviously we could go down a rabbit hole there, but let's kind of make a shift towards the more white pill stuff, which I think is the creativity and hope that you find, or that I find in listening to what you're doing in carving out a life for yourself that you control.
Yeah, so there's something that's been really important to us, both me and my wife, since we left the UK. That was one of the key reasons that we came to Poland, actually, was not just because my wife's Polish, of course. There's lots of threats to be in Europe right now because there's so many of these things that we're discussing taking place. However, Poland is still a beautiful country. It's very rooted in nature. It's very rooted in the old ways. So we're talking people who take care of themselves. Where we live, everyone chops wood to heat the house. Everyone has a garden out back. Everyone has chickens. Pretty much, literally everyone. There's not a single person I know around here who doesn't have some kind of fowl or bird back in the garden. And obviously, yeah, we all have wells. We all look after ourselves as much as we can. So that was key, because what I foresaw coming, as you've gathered from this interview, is it's not the best future. There's going to be some real hardship. And even if we have the best outcome there, it's still going to be extremely hard. And we're already seeing that. We're seeing people start to get wiped out financially just from inflation before it's ever even really took off. So we wanted to insulate ourselves from that, Monica, and also to protect our freedoms as much as possible, because in the future that they're essentially planning for us is complete dependency on the state. I mean, that's what a CBDC would be. It would be a complete control tool. Of course, we've got smart cities and all these other threats coming. So we wanted to get as far away from all of that as we could, get our homestead up and running, and start to build a community based on actual, real, natural living. And of course, I've started, I've got my channel and I've got my Patreon group, private Telegram group, and we're actually sharing those messages, all building our little arcs all across the world, and then linking up and actually creating a separate system. That's what it's about, a parallel system, so that even if this mainstream system does become this dystopian algorithm ghetto, as Hrvoje Morić says, or electronic concentration camp, as I call it, whatever it becomes, we actually will still have a lot of autonomy in our system, and we'll be able to fight from a much higher ground. We might buy ourselves another 20 years, but it's not running away, Monica. It's more about having a high ground to fight from. They're not going to control your food. They're not going to control your energy. They're not going to control your money. And that's key in this, is to get that autonomy and self-sufficiency now before the crisis comes.
I really worry about the possibility that building a parallel system or going off the grid is abandoning the ground. And I worry about that. And I see parallels with the 60s, where they got people to, get on drugs and tune out, or draft dodgers had to leave the country. And they were this huge new generation, the biggest generation of Americans probably ever, certainly till that time, were politically neutralized. And I do worry, I've said it, if people listen to my show, hear me all the time, always searching for or imploring people to, if they do choose the homesteading route, you still have to, I mean, you read stories all the time. They're coming around killing people's chickens. They used COVID as an excuse to kill animals, to starve us out of our farms. How do you protect your gun rights? You certainly need guns if you're going to live alone out there, and hopefully be able to hunt and protect yourself from human beings who don't have food when the cities collapse, if that's where we're headed. And also water rights, I worry about. I also worry about chemtrails polluting the water or stopping rain from happening or putting, heavy metals into your soil. Like these are things that are happening in the world that you have to not only be aware of, but hopefully try to, stall.
Yeah, it's not easy. And, we think about all these things. So, of course, we've got our well, we gather rainwater and all of those other things that you mentioned too. We grow our own trees so that we can have wood. We coppice so it's sustainable. We have all kinds of things that we're implementing. But first and foremost, it's not, like you said, it's not about escapism, because at the end of the day, they're coming for everyone. You could go live in a cave for the rest of your life and maybe escape it, but who wants to live like that anyways? I certainly don't. It's about having community and people. And yeah, and I frame this as a spiritual battle too, Monica. So there's no cowardice there. You can't be just fleeing. You've got to stand up to what's coming and face it. However, if you are stuck in a city, particularly if you're in the UK, where you've got this melting pot of different people coming in now, people that you don't know, strangers who are more prone to violence because they're young, or they're from cultures that are probably more violent by default. They're not steeped in, let's say, our culture and societal norms. Then you're in real trouble. You're in real danger, because all it would take is for one crisis in that city, whether it's financial or a food crisis or an energy crisis, and you've got so many people packed in, then you've got a crisis that's going to come right to your door. And like you said, it could be a threat to your safety in life, or you might just not be able to get enough food or water. There's all kinds of things that could happen. So first and foremost, it's about getting that high ground to fight from. If you've got your own well, if you've got your own food grain, if you've got a food store, if you've got chickens or fowl, yes, they could come and take all that stuff from you. However, if you think about it and you move yourself to a place where lots of people are doing a similar thing, like I said, rural Poland, where we are, everyone lives like this. It's an agricultural country. There's a whole army of people there. They're called farmers, and they are not going to sit back while people try and devastate their livelihoods or take their housing from them or take their means of heating themselves. You know what I mean? So it's also about finding that club to be in, that people that are going to be like you, they're going to have similar beliefs. Now, in the UK, I couldn't find that, which is why we came to a more agricultural country where people want to live this way. It's the norm here. But there's lots of battles ahead, though. The Dutch farmers are having their battles right now. That's going to spread across Europe. And we're all going to have to be engaged in all of these battles, because even if you're not a farmer, it's still your battle. They're fighting back against this agenda too. So, you know what I mean? We've all got to join in each battle as though it is our battle, even if it's not, because eventually it does become you. It does become your battle.
I agree with that. I always hear there are all these, they are encroaching on our rights, and often they'll set as a precedent somebody who did something terrible, Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and then they'll mess with the process so that you lose some rights and nobody will defend them because they're jerks. And so I always say, first they came for the assholes and no one would defend them. And then, they came for the whatever. But I feel like it is true, even if, that's a good point. Even if I'm not ready to go full homestead, I should probably start plugging in now, especially people in the world, and paying attention to, I think the federal laws are just so hard to beat back. And even the statewide stuff is so hard. So I imagine it would make sense to pick a place where at least there are still gun rights and chicken rights and the water rights, and start from there with people who really understand it. And yeah, you can't choose the high ground in a place where that's already been defeated.
No, yeah, and it's also about how society is too. So, one of the big things about the country that I'm in, for example, is they've got recent experience of hardship. Totalitarian rule by the Soviets didn't end until 1989. Now, MTV already existed in the West, and yet they were still living over here under totalitarianism. That's wild. My wife grew up during the hyperinflation. She remembers going to a shop and seeing nothing but one loaf of bread. That's all you could buy, the same loaf of bread. You know what I mean? So even people my age still have experiences of hardship. They know what it's like to be self-sufficient to have to grow your own food, because if you don't, you're not going to eat. You know, my wife, some of the foods that she had to eat when she was younger, it was like bread dripped in fat. You know, that's all they had.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
you know, that experience sticks with people, and it means that as you grow up and go through life, you never become fully dependent. You know, you always keep something in reserve. People store food here. You know, they've always got an eye to, you know what, I remember when we lived through those times, and I remember what the government was like. So that fear of totalitarianism still sticks around, and it keeps people honest. It stops them from becoming too dependent. Now, in the West, sadly, we've become very decadent. If you go to the US, in many places, particularly young people, you know, and same in the Great Britain, you know, my family, you know, they would never believe that the world could go back to something like that, where you have food shortages or energy crisis. However, you know, I was warning them in 2018, 2019. Right now, they're talking about blackouts in the UK. So, you know, we're already there. It happened very quickly. And the next stage of it will happen quickly. And I think that's food, Monica. So that's the big one that's on the horizon, in my opinion.
It does happen very quickly. So a little bit of, I've heard what you said about the cities. You know, they've got like 2 days. I have a month's worth of dried food in my house. And, but that's it. Like, I have nothing alive. Like, I really need chickens and a dairy cow. I always feel like when the stuff hits the fan, you want animals that can make animal protein out of garbage, basically, about stuff that you don't have to actually cultivate and still not have to kill the thing. But this is so far removed from my life, because my kids like are applying for college, going to college. And for the longest time, I mean, since they were little, I was like, do not feel compelled to go to college, to the point where I was like, hey, I'm not paying for it. I don't think it's a good idea. If you want to do it, you know, but you can't, you know, I'm not willing to like put my foot down and be like, you have to opt out forever. But they, you know, that most people are so far behind taking any of this stuff seriously, despite the fact that even the normie history is riddled. I mean, it's just the rise and fall of countries. That's all it is, basically. And I wonder,
every empire, Monica, eventually falls, and the US is in those final stages now. It doesn't mean that it's going to fall off a cliff. But it could certainly have a collapse that leaves it looking something like the Soviet Empire's collapse. You know, so let's think of Russia in 1992, 1993, where people were I mean, you've already got huge problems over there, not in the middle classes. However, we know what happens in a financial crisis. It can wipe out those middle classes very, very quickly. I think in the US, the average debt of a citizen is around 100K. In terms of the actual governmental debt, you all owe around 100K per citizen. You know, it's huge. So if there's a financial collapse in the US, it will wipe out a lot of people very quickly. So this is just something to think about. It's not necessarily about running to the hills and creating communes and all of this. It's more just about thinking, like, what would I do? You know, could I scale back my life a bit? Could I just become a little bit more self-sufficient? Maybe have a get out of Dodge place in the countryside with maybe 6 months worth of food. Maybe it's got a well. You know, it doesn't have to be immediately I'm panicking running for the hills, but it does have to, you know, you do have to think about this. Just look historically about how things have gone. You know, these things come back around, and the US is certainly not immune to it. You know, its day in the sun has to come to an end eventually.
Well, I also think it's not just the idea of not having food, which of course that is where the rubber hits the road, and I'm more concerned with that than I used to be. But I still feel like ideals matter, and that I feel like people like you and me care about freedom, and I want to understand what that means to you. And I also want to, you know, get your view on why is it that, yes, everyone would be afraid of a food shortage if they were convinced it were coming, but they are happy to give up their freedom for the slightest bit of safety. I know that's the oldest, most hackneyed expression, but it still shocks me. And I, you know, are there two kinds of people? Like, some people who care about freedom, do they not know how to define it? I mean, what is it to you, and why doesn't everybody have that desire?
Yeah, I think the best way to understand freedom is to contrast it with the lack of freedom, and we all got a good taste of that during the last few years. I mean, this is totalitarianism. Let's make no mistake about what we're facing here. We're facing a global totalitarianism, and once it's enshrined through the technology, it's going to be unescapable. You know, it could literally be a dark ages of hundreds of years. because we're going to be so trapped within that system that we will never get out of it. We'll never be able to muster up the strength because they've got all of the monopoly on violence, on guns, on weapons. And then once they've got that on money and your day-to-day lives through these algorithms and having control over smart cities and whatnot, it really is going to be impossible for the plebs that we are to rise up and get out of that. Look at China. China's doing a great example of how hard it is for the people to get up. So that really gives you an idea of what freedom is. Freedom is not that. Freedom is not having somebody dictate your every movement. Freedom is not having somebody control how you spend your money. It's not having someone control your energy. It's not having someone control your voice, telling you that, what we have in the West is this soft totalitarianism. So it's like, Monica, you don't have to wave the flag. You don't have to go to the parade. If you don't, yeah, exactly. You're going to get swamped on Twitter. You're going to have all these nasty comments. You might never get a mainstream job again because somebody will out you and say, oh, Monica said this before about trans people. You know what I mean?
Or if you object to, like the January 6th thing was a totally peaceful protest. It wasn't even a protest. They were there to give their support to a process that was going to take a few days and it would have settled everything. And instead, anybody who exercised that First Amendment right to assembly or petition, which nobody even talks about, that there's all that was at stake there. They're being persecuted. I mean, there were agents provocateur. It was a terrible situation. And yes, that I think it's a good way of you're looking at it, is that if you go for, if we don't have the freedom to do that, yes, that doesn't mean that the next day some FBI agent is at your door. Although I know plenty of people who that did happen to them after January 6th, like FBI came to their door. And I think it was to suppress any kind of video or anything that would have come out about how peaceful it was. There would have been millions, of minutes of video but anybody who put a video up, their friends would get visited by the FBI. So that's a real lack of freedom. But that is, I think, going to what we were talking about in the beginning, that is it's preparation in service to a time when they actually have to use it, and you're not going to like it. You're not going to be like, well, those people are insurrectionists, or I don't want to catch a cold from you, or whatever. People are kind of going along with it now because psychologically they believe that this is consistent with our free society and has some universal value, which to my mind is a contradiction in terms anyway, or not in terms, but there's a little bit of a conflict there, push and pull, that I'm not willing to compromise with. But there will be a time, if this is a financial collapse or in any case, economic hardship, where the things that you're not allowed to do, you really want to do and need to do, and people will resent it then, but it will be too late.
Yeah, and totalitarianism can come in three forms, and I think we've lost sight of the final one. So, you can have totalitarianism come in through some big revolution, which is what happened in Soviet Russia, for example. You can have totalitarianism come in, sorry, not Soviet Russian, sorry, revolutionary Russia. You can have totalitarianism come in through what we saw in 1930s Germany, where it's democratically elected in. So you elect in a dictator. Or you can have it come in like de Tocqueville said when he came to America in the 1800s. And what he said was, if totalitarianism comes into America, this is how it's going to arrive. It's going to arrive through welfareism, through people becoming more and more dependent on the state and allowing the state to have creep in its life. So all of a sudden the state's taking care of your food, your heating, your energy. And that's where we are now. We're on the precipice of having complete dependency on the state. And young people are actually willing it in. And of course, all of the ideologies back that up too. So every ideology at its core will lead to more censorship, more state control over what you get to say, what you get to do. Same with any crisis like a pandemic. Every one of them leads back to the state having more control. So that's how totalitarianism has been snuck under the door. Nobody was looking for that. We was looking for a man in a funny mustache.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I do feel like the more wealth you have, the more wealth there is, surplus wealth to support a truly efficient technocratic totalitarianism. But so I think this is a good.
Think about how much money is going to be needed, Monica, to bring this into being. To have these transformations of these smart cities. It's going to be like the development of the nuclear bomb times 1,000, maybe times 1,000,000, because it's going to cost so much. And maybe this is part of why we're having these energy rationing, because they're going to have to divert so much energy towards creating this new world. It's not going to come in overnight.
If you dig into the Infosys website, that's Rishi Sunak's family, Infosys, they talk about that. They want to divert government money into building the infrastructure necessary for a truly functional universal metaverse. And I mean, they talk about like one dig is one of the things they talk about, where you just to dig up the ground to put enough cable in there or whatever it is, like light. I forget what it's called.
Don't you think this is hilarious though, Monica, that on the one hand they're telling us that they're going to save the planet and we have to start rationing energy, we have to destroy farming, but on the other hand, they're designing a world that will be infinitely more consumption based in terms of energy than the current one. You know,
just energy. It'll just be pure energy.
Yeah. I mean, do we really need a sensor in every single item, every single human being? Like, we was looking for a washing machine recently. We couldn't find a washing machine that wasn't going to one day connect to the Internet of Things. I mean,
oh yeah, it doesn't have like a camera in it.
I was like, I said to my wife, can't you just get us a regular washing machine? She was like, no, they're all smart washing machines.
No,
this is wild.
You'll have to be the washing machine. So I think this is a good place to wrap and direct people to. So you give us the big picture, and I love that. I love how you explain things and understand them deeply. And I knew that I could ask you any question, and you would be able to answer it. But your real, where the rubber hits the road with you for real, is your practical. You're living this life and sharing this journey with people, like how to have an emergency energy supply, or longer term, or how to, the kind of land you need to live on, and, everything that people need to know to actually live this life. And that's in the work that you do. Tell us about your podcast and your, how often do you do it? You have a couple of different series, I know. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I like to do a lot of videos based around the financial collapse and about the monetary system, because I think that's really important. And one thing that I'm very sad and scared about is that a lot of people are going to lose everything in the coming crisis. So I really want to educate people on that, just so they can start to make decisions for themselves. No one's going to tell you about those things in the mainstream. So you need to look into it. You need to look at where your money is, and you need to start preparing. If you lose your pension at this point in your life, then you're not going to get that money back, especially with the way the global economy is going. You're not going to be able to earn it back. So I focus on that a lot. But I also, like you said, I focus on getting people practically prepared, helping them figure out, how am I going to get more self-sufficiency? Because in my opinion, that is the key to freedom in the future. The more self-sufficient you are, the more freedom you've got. The more freedom you've got, the louder your voice can be in opposing things, because you're not going to be told that you're going to lose your job, for example. That's not going to frighten you so much if you've got some more independence, if you've got some self-sufficiency in terms of your income. So all of those things we talk about. We also talk a lot about philosophy as well, and about spirituality. So I actually do a weekly live stream that is more focused towards that side of things. So we talk about, how do we raise our vibration in life? How do we insulate ourselves from this fear-based culture? How do we build loving relationships? How do we build communities? All of these things are on people's mind right now, Monica, because people want to feel connection again, real human connection. And again, this is something that they want to starve us of, because it helps them to bring about this dystopia. So that's it's kind of like we talk a lot about finance, but there's also this kind of self-development part of it too, which I think is really important, because that makes meaning out of this whole crisis. If you manage to develop yourself, if you manage to use this as an opportunity to improve your life, to improve your partner's life, to improve your children's life, yes, it's going to be hard. However, many of us had fallen into old lazy patterns, and now we've got that opportunity to renew our lives and to make something better, something more meaningful. Now, it might end in a big fight, Monica. It might mean that we all have to stand side by side and fight someone. But that's okay as well, because let's face it, no one's getting out of this one alive, and we have to stand up for human dignity. That's what it's all about, in my opinion.
Well, I am so ready to have that conversation with you next time. I've been really trying to expand my mind in that regard. There's is it Christopher Dawson, I think, was a mid-20th century Catholic philosopher, I guess, and he talked about the end of Christianity in Europe, or if there was hope there. He talked about the importance of culture. I'm reading a book right now called Society and Sanity. and it's goes hand in hand with another book reading Libertarianism and the Church, about like Catholic social teaching, which to me, like, I would never even pick anything up on that. Guido Preparata has a book on it too, who writes about Conjuring Hitler and the ideology of tyranny. I think you would like Preparata stuff if you haven't already looked at it. But I always figured Catholic social teaching was just like socialism, but it's not. It's really a richer answer to the questions of how to view society, if nothing more, from a perspective of like, what is, because my libertarian thing is very like black and white. I want to separate church and state. I want to separate the economy from the state. But it's important not to neglect the fact that human beings are not animals. They're not just, Homo economicus or whatever they call, like the economic man. There's more to that. And if you can explain that stuff, your views on that, as well as you explain the big picture of the global financial system, then I'll be emailing you like immediately to set up another one of these if you're
I'd love
you're
to
game.
talk to people about that, Monica. And it's a joint conversation. That's a conversation, isn't it? We're all trying to figure out, make sense of our lives, make sense of what is meaningful. Why are we here? And I think we all have a huge opportunity there. So, embrace it, accept that there's going to be hardships, but also, use it as that opportunity, like I said. And, that begins by speaking with one another like we are right now. I think that's the perfect way to start exploring this stuff. So let's do it again.
I absolutely love it. Okay, so hang on a sec. I'm gonna just wrap it up, and then I'll say goodbye to you offline. So thank you all for listening. This is Parallel Mike of the Parallel Systems broadcast, and you have been listening to Live Dives with Monica Perez.